It all started when I was 7 years old. When I was 7 years old, my father woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning to tell me that my mom cheated on him with his best friend. Right after that, everything went downhill. Every night when I'd come home from school and my dad was home from work, there was argument after argument. And immediately, me being the protective person that I am over my mom, I would go and try to stop that argument immediately. And as soon as I'd walk in, I'd immediately see that my father hit my mom. Now, this didn't just happen one time, it happened on multiple occasions. After that, he left, and he moved out. Now, throughout my middle school years up until my freshman year of high school, I went through everything you could possibly imagine. The anger, I'd go to school every day just constantly angry and have some sort of panic attack over something that triggered a response from what I was experiencing at home. I went through the depression. I didn't want to leave my room because not only was I mourning my father leaving the home, but I was also experiencing my family being torn apart. Now, I'm not the only child. I have 4 other siblings, and I'm the youngest. Now, it all affected us differently, but I saw everything that was going on from when I was 7 up until this past August when my parents finally got a divorce. Now, throughout that time when they were separated, my dad was the one who was making the money while my mom was home, not only just taking care of me, but along as my other siblings. Throughout that time, I knew when my dad's paydays were every 2 weeks. He was the one who was giving me the checks to give to my mom. And I noticed anytime there was an argument between them, the money wasn't there. Even if I got into an argument with him, because my father and I's relationship is not that great. It's not like that daddy, little girl kind of relationship that you think a normal daughter would have. And anytime I get into an argument with him, he'd keep the money. If I didn't want to see him, he'd keep the money. And I realized, what's going on? And throughout the years, as I was going through therapy and I asked questions, that's whenever I found out that not only was I, but my mom was also being financially abused. Which leads me to the topic of what are the effects that financial abuse can have on teenagers? Now, to start off, what the definition of financial abuse is, it's basically whether it's your father, your mother, a spouse, even between siblings. It can happen in multiple ways. It can't just happen within a marriage. Is whenever they are purposely keeping the money from you on purpose. And to know when you are being financially abused, one is restrict daily spending. Now, this would include, say your spouse is saying, you are only allowed to spend $25 today. And that goes on and on. Next one is stealing money. Then the third is preventing access to accounts. Now, with that, there can easily be an account hidden that your spouse has opened up just so they can hide money from you because they don't want you to have access to it. Say there's only one person working in the relationship. Well, the normal saying is, I'm the one who's making the money, it's yours. It's not yours, it's mine. Then sabotaging employment or school. An example would be, my mom wanted to go back to school to complete and possibly get an associate's. Well, with that, in order to qualify for the financial aid, there has to be a certain amount of money proven that you make so that you're able to qualify for it. Now, when asking my dad to prove how much she gets from him, he didn't want to. So in that's purposely withholding that money so she's not able to get the schooling that she's wanting. And then debt. We all know that in order to buy a car, buy a house, or even get a credit card, you have to have some sort of credit that's run. Now, if you're in debt, that isn't going to be possible because that credit score is going to be low due to the sabotage of whether it's your spouse or anybody else who's in control of that money. Now leading to my research process. This was the most frustrating part, not only because there wasn't much done. As I was researching, I noticed there was more about financial abuse being taken between the elderly, but there wasn't anything between whether it's spouse or even teenagers and what they go through with it. But what I did find was that 30% of women go through abuse in their lifetime. Now, within those, 94% of those who go through abuse, in all of them, there's financial abuse within them, which led me to the question, well, if almost all of these relationships have gone through financial abuse, why isn't research being done on it? Why isn't a topic that's talked about? All the topics that are talked about are sexual, physical, emotional, and verbal abuse. But why isn't financial being talked? Why isn't it being studied? Which then, because of course I'm focusing more on the teenagers, I couldn't find anything. So I just had to go back. Well, how does abuse in general affect children? And what are the effects? Now I found out that just by merely witnessing the abuse, it can automatically change a child's maladaptive behavior patterns. Now, I was able to relate to that. While I was not being physically abused, just the fact that I was witnessing it with my mom, it changed me. It changed how I acted and everything that was going on. And 78% of Americans don't consider it to be a form of domestic abuse. But why is that? Now, I wanted to see the legal side of everything. How do the courts recognize this, and do they even recognize it as a form of abuse? So I had gotten contacted with a family law attorney named Robin Scott. She was an attorney that helped my mom with the divorce. And I asked her some of the questions, and the first one that I asked her was, does the court recognize financial abuse? And she said yes, but in family law terms, they don't consider it or say it's financial abuse. They call it a wasting away of assets. And the definition of that is to cause harm to marital estate. Now, an example of wasting away of assets could be supporting others. And what I mean by that is a boyfriend and a girlfriend. So say there's a divorce going on. If that spouse is supporting the boyfriend and the girlfriend to say, I don't have money, but the reason why they're saying that is because they're trying to spend all of that money on their boyfriend and girlfriend, on buying them gifts, taking them on fancy vacations, just to prove that they don't have money so they don't have to share it with who they're getting a divorce with. And I can relate to that. Throughout the years, whenever my parents first separated, my dad got a girlfriend. And that's whenever everything really changed. I would go to him and say, hey, Dad, I need this for whatever occasion that I needed something for. Or I'd go to my mom, hey, Mom, I need this. And we'd have to say, well, we have to wait for the check to come in. Now, when that check wasn't coming in, it's like, well, where's all the money going? And my dad would complain, saying, oh, I don't have money. You're saying you don't have money, but you're out buying a new car. You're out buying another Mustang, and now you're buying a Jeep. So if you don't have any money, where is it all going? And then we find out he's spending it on the girlfriend, taking her on fancy vacations, buying her jewelry. It's like, oh, that's where it's all going. Instead of going to your child that you know you have to provide for where your money goes, you're spending it on the girlfriend. And then self-employment records. Now, whenever there's a process of a divorce, the first thing that they look at is the W-2. But when it comes to self-employment, it's not that easy to look at the records because of the fact that accounts can be opened so that self-employee can just hide the money away to where it can't be found. And because W-2s are the only thing that are looked at, not self-employment, it's easier to get away with it. But what are the courts doing to say, hey, let's look at those self-employment records, and so we know how much that person is really making? Now, for the second part of my research, I wanted to go to the Houston Area Women's Center, where they have victims of multiple forms of abuse, and they have groups ranging from teenagers to adults. And I wanted to go in there and to be able to interview those victims and see, well, based on the abuse that you went through, how did it affect you, whether it's psychologically, mentally, physically? But I was not able to do that due to, one, I'm not a professional psychologist or anything. I would have to have permission to go in there, and I'd have to be qualified. And that would not only put possibly me in danger, but those victims in danger also, because while they're there for the purpose of healing from the trauma that they've gone through, me going in there as not a professional will put them at harm because they could possibly have a relapse. So I said, okay, well, let me try to find a book on financial abuse. I went to Barnes & Noble, and I noticed all the books in the section were mainly about physical or sexual abuse. And I didn't find anything on financial, not even abuse for teens and helping them to recognize the signs of when they're being abused or when they're possibly witnessing it. So I went to Amazon, searched for a book on financial abuse again. And luckily, I only found one that I felt had the answers to everything that I needed. And that title was Exposing Financial Abuse When Money is Used as a Weapon, and that was by Shannon Thomas. Immediately, I grabbed the book, and I read the whole thing, and after that, I emailed the author to see if I could interview her. And she was glad to help, and luckily, she's a licensed psychologist. Now, whenever I interviewed her, the first question I asked her was what were the driving forces that wanted her to make this research and write a book about financial abuse. And she said that whenever she wrote her first book, which was about healing from abuse, she noticed that in all of the stories that she heard, financial abuse was one of the main ones that was talked about. But when she was researching on her own, there wasn't any research done on financial abuse, which led her to want to do it on her own. Now, I asked her, was it hard finding participants? Because I know with me, it was hard. I went around school asking people, do you know what financial abuse is? And if you do, would you be willing to participate and help me? And the majority of the responses I got was, what's financial abuse? Financial abuse exists? And I said, yes. What do you think the definition of it is? And they would say, oh, I just think it means just spending your money not wisely. I was like, well, no. And the next question I asked her was, how many participants did you have? And she said she had over 2,000 stories, but over 450 participants. This is the graph of all the participants that she had. In the blue, it was 95% of women and 4% of male, which is in the green. But in the yellow is 1%, which was the gender they chose not to disclose of what they are. Now, on the left side, you'll see the age ranges. I asked her, was there a specific age range that you wanted, or did you just welcome anybody? And she said, well, I just welcomed anybody. Now, as we see, the younger that the age ranges are, the less there are. But as you get older, there's more stories. So I asked her, is it possible that there's less stories on the younger people because they possibly aren't aware of the facts of what maybe even abuse is, or when they're going through it? And she said, yes, because our brains aren't fully developed until mid-late 20s. Well, us as teenagers, it's harder for us to comprehend those kind of things. But it's even harder when there aren't resources out there to help. And so what are we supposed to do whenever a teenager is possibly going through an abusive relationship, but there's nothing out there that's helping them to realize that that's what they're going through? So then, as I was reading along more in the book, she talks about what's called a bait and switch game. I asked her, what do you mean by a bait and switch game? And she said that basically means when the abuser is saying, oh, I don't have any money, but they're turning around and saying maybe they're buying a yacht. I was like, well, I can really relate to that. Now, there was a quote that she talked about, and she said, the basic needs of children are secondary to the selfishness of the toxic parent. And I asked her, well, how does that possibly affect a teenager? Well, the answer to that was the teenager could possibly feel like they aren't important. Say the teenager is in school and they're taking a test. Well, as parents, there's some sort of expectations. You have to get a good grade. There's a certain grade average that you'd want for your child. Now, when they don't reach that expectation, some parents will say, well, couldn't you have done better? Why did you just get this? You couldn't have gotten higher? But that alone will cause the teenager to feeling of never enough. Nothing that they ever do will ever be enough for the parent because the parent is constantly saying, couldn't you have done better? Couldn't you have gotten higher than a 90? But that causes more harm than good. The next one was that relationships are conditional. Now, with the financial abuse part as to how that can go into teenagers, Well, let's just say the parent says, I'll give you your allowance if you make a 95 on a test. I'll give you this allowance if you go and do this for me. But the minute that teenager possibly doesn't make that 90 or 95 on a test, that allowance is taken away. How is that not a form of financial abuse in itself? Now going back to the divorce. Say there's a child or multiple children involved. Child support needs to be paid. Now those who are self-employed are purposely withholding that money. Even those who aren't self-employed, they want to hold that money because in their eyes, this is my money, I pay, I worked hard for this. But they're neglecting the fact that they have a child that they need to support. How is that not a form of abuse towards not just the other spouse, but towards the child? You're purposely withholding money because of your selfish desires while you're neglecting the needs of your child. And what kind of effect does that have when the teenager knows what's going on? And I could relate to that because my dad was fighting over money. He wanted it all to belong to him. And the act of his own selfish desires, he forgot that he had a teenage daughter to look out for, to save up money to be able to go to college. And throughout that process, whenever it came time to me talking to my father about going to college and what I wanted to do for my life, I told him, I want to go to Texas Women's University. I want to become a physical therapist. I want to get my doctorates in it. First reaction I got, how are you going to pay for it? My reaction, you're my father. Aren't you going to help me? And the response I got was, I don't have any money. And I asked him, well, where did it go? And then I look around, and he's spending all of his money on whether it's things for his car, things for his house, for collectibles, buying little cars to collect them. You're saying you don't have any money, but you're spending it in all of these unnecessary things instead of saving that same exact money that you're spending to go towards a child who's wanting to go to college. And then, back to Shannon Thomas, I then asked her again, what are the effects that this can have on teenagers? These are the results. That teenagers could see relationships as being conditional. Teenagers might get involved in abusive relationships, the feeling of never enough, suicidal thoughts, depression, drugs, and alcohol. And I asked her, well, how does each of those things go under financial abuse? And somehow she ended up connecting all of them. The teenager could have suicidal thoughts because of the feelings of never enough. And because of the feelings of never enough, whenever the allowance isn't being taken because their parent is basically telling them they're not doing good enough for them to be able to get that allowance, they say, well, what's the point of even trying anymore if nothing I ever do is good enough? And then I was like, I went through every single one of those things throughout my middle school years up until my freshman year. I have had every single one. Now, if you look at someone who's gone through sexual, physical, verbal, or even emotional abuse, I guarantee that they have had every single one of those effects also, somehow, some way. Now, the question is, why is it that abuse is only recognized whenever you see cuts or bruises on a body on the external? But why isn't it also taken into consideration what's going on internally? What's going on in the psychological side of that teenager's mind? The effects that someone who's gone through sexual and physical abuse can have the same thing as someone who's gone through financial. But what is being done for research to be done on financial abuse so that it's finally recognized that it is equal as any other form of abuse? That just because I may not have bruises or cuts on my body does not mean that I am any less than any other victim who's gone through sexual or physical. We've all had the same effects. But what's being done for something to finally be heard about financial abuse and for awareness to be brought to it so that teenagers can be more aware, and so they know what to look out for those future generations, so they can break the cycles of repeating the same things that their parents have gone through, doing the same thing that they witnessed whenever their parents were together and the abuse that they saw. Thank you.